You notice it in a moment that doesn't announce itself. Nothing collapses. Nothing resolves. You're simply no longer responding the way you used to. Something happens, ordinary, familiar, and the expected internal reaction doesn't arrive on time. The urgency that once stepped in immediately feels delayed, like it missed its cue. The thought still forms, but it doesn't position itself as necessary. It doesn't claim the room. You pause without meaning to. Not because you're unsure, but because there's no pressure to move. The old rhythm tries to resume, interpret, adjust, prepare, but it feels optional. You don't reject it. You just don't follow. There's no clarity attached to this moment. No explanation. Only a quiet sense that the internal authority you once leaned on is no longer standing where it used to. You don't name this. You don't need to. And the moment keeps going, unresolved, as if it's waiting to see whether anything inside you still needs it to mean more. Before, authority lived in small, convincing places. It didn't shout. It suggested. It showed up as a feeling that certain thoughts deserved immediate attention, that certain reactions were justified before you could question them. It organized your decisions without asking permission. It made urgency feel responsible. It made responsiveness feel like alignment. Even rest carried a background tension, as if something important might slip past if you disengaged too long. You stayed slightly leaned forward, oriented toward what needed handling next. Now that lean isn't there. The signals still appear, but they don't carry the same weight. The body doesn't mobilize automatically. The mind offers commentary, but it doesn't feel binding. You're not detached. You're just not recruited. From the outside, nothing looks different. Inside, the hierarchy has shifted. What once commanded now waits. And the waiting doesn't feel unstable. It feels sufficient, as if something essential already stepped aside without explanation. You might expect this gap to feel uncomfortable. You might expect uncertainty to rush in and demand structure. But it doesn't. The space holds. Not because you're managing it, but because nothing is trying to fill it. The system keeps functioning without constant instruction. Situations arise, and responses happen without internal escalation. You act when action is required. You pause when it's not. Neither one asks to be framed as progress or failure. The old pressure, to respond correctly, to anticipate outcomes, to make the moment meaningful, appears briefly and then dissolves. It doesn't argue for relevance. It doesn't insist. Attention stays closer to what's actually happening instead of racing ahead to what it might become. Not as a practice. Simply because nothing is pulling it forward anymore. The unresolved moment from earlier continues, unchanged. Still open. Still unclaimed by interpretation. And somehow, that feels more stable than any conclusion ever did. In daily life, the shift looks almost unremarkable. You read something without assigning it hidden significance. You hear news without feeling reorganized by it. Routines no longer feel like placeholders for something more important that hasn't arrived yet. Even uncertainty behaves differently. It doesn't rush to define itself. It doesn't demand resolution. It stays open without pressure. Before, these were the entry points. The old structure used them to regain authority, framing them as signals that required interpretation. Now they pass through without being promoted to command. You're not disengaged. You're simply not being pulled. There's nothing dramatic to point to. Just a steady absence of internal escalation. What once pressed now suggests. What once rushed now waits. And because nothing is competing for control, the moment you're still inside remains intact, quietly deepening without asking for closure. There's a subtle habit that tries to return here. The desire for a sentence that would finalize this. A realization you could repeat to yourself as proof that something ended. But nothing about this state resolves through language. It stabilizes through non-interference. You notice stretches of time where nothing in you is monitoring your state. No checking for alignment. No wondering if you're doing this right. These gaps used to feel unsafe. Now they feel ordinary. That ordinariness matters. It means the system isn't scanning for a replacement authority. It isn't looking for a new framework to follow. It's learning how to remain without supervision. Thoughts still appear, but they don't insist on relevance. Familiar storylines surface and feel slightly out of sync, not wrong, just unnecessary. You don't correct them. You don't follow them. And the unresolved moment doesn't demand meaning. It simply stays. Occasionally, the old authority tests its position indirectly. Not through commands, but through questions. What if this is avoidance? What if something important requires more effort? What if you're missing a step? These questions once carried weight because they implied responsibility. They suggested vigilance was proof of care. Now they arise and pause without momentum. Nothing rushes to answer. The body no longer braces when uncertainty appears. Breathing stays even. Attention stays local. Even when action is required, it arrives without compression. Before, authority worked through readiness, a constant forward tension. With that pathway quieted, the old timeline loses its leverage. The future doesn't pull. The past doesn't tense. What remains is a system regulated enough to stay where it is. You can feel how complete the shift is by what it leaves behind. Situations end without continuing internally. Conversations finish without replay. Decisions don't linger as identity statements. The residue that once kept the old timeline relevant no longer accumulates. Time moves without pressure. Waiting doesn't feel charged. Pauses don't imply failure. The present isn't squeezed between correction and anticipation. Nothing new replaces what was lost. You move through days without framing them as steps in a process. You don't track progress. You don't wait for confirmation. Life feels ordinary in a way that's reliable rather than flat. This message doesn't guide you forward. It meets you where guidance is no longer required. The old timeline has already stepped down. Quietly. And what continues now doesn't need authority to keep going.